This is Greg Troutwine with Maritime Reporter TV, and we're here with Knut Ørbeck-Nilssen, CEO Maritime, DNV GL. And Knut, thank you very much for taking your time to join us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Knut, I know you well. We've had many conversations and interviews over the years, but for our viewers and readers who are not so familiar with yourself, can you give me a brief biography of your career and an overview of your responsibilities?
Sure. So I'm, as you said, the CEO of DNV GL Maritime. I've been in the position for about 1.5 years. I worked with the company, though, for 25 years. I worked mainly in the maritime, but also part of the time in the oil and gas industry. I'm a civil engineer of background, and I'm enjoying a lot to work in the shipping industry.
So with, and Knut, I know from my experience with DNV GL, you're a very progressive organization in looking at future trends. But when you look at the maritime industry today, what do you see?
Well, I see an industry that is, in a lot of distress at the moment. I mean, we are basically facing oversupply in most segments. The only exception is basically the cruise and the passenger ro-packs segments. But apart from that, I think most segments are struggling, whether it's the drilling units or the bulkers or the containers. And we are basically facing a tremendous super cycle that we enjoyed over the past 10 years, being the globalization of industries at large, but also China coming out of communism and really trying to, play a much more dominant role in the manufacturing and commercial sides of industry. So that is something that will not come back, and I think for the next few years we will be faced with oversupply in quite a lot of segments until the markets balance out.
Okay. So Knut, obviously one of the few bright spots that we see today is generally in the passenger vessel, but also in the bigger ship side, the cruise sector. Can you give a little more specifics on what you're seeing? Why is this sector doing well today?
Yeah, so if we start off with the cruise segment, so this is enjoying a tremendous growth. I mean, passenger numbers are up. There are more destinations. We also see growth in the Chinese market, which holds a lot of potential going forward. So for cruise, it's a lot about growth. When we look at the ferries, it is more about replacing existing tonnage, modernizing existing tonnage, in some cases moving to more environmental friendly fuel like LNG. So there are basically different drivers, but all the same, there is some sentiment for ordering new builds in both of these segments.
Okay. As we just discussed before we started here, I had the opportunity to interview Remy Eriksson on the occasion of the SMM 2016. At the time, he was quite frank in his assessment of the market and the need to reduce the headcount at DNV GL to deal with the near-term crisis. I know it's only 3 months past this interview, but can you give me, has that view changed for 2017, or can you give our viewers and our readers an update on how you see near-term 2017?
I think 2017 is going to be even more challenging for DNV GL as a group. It's basically down to both the oil and gas markets and the shipping and the offshore markets in turmoil and distress. So 17 is going to look challenging for us. But I think also if we extend it a little bit further, it's going to take some time before markets balance out. So we probably for the next few years will have challenging market conditions in most segments.
Okay. New rules enter force and they cost ship owners money. What has DNV GL done along the way that is helping to make the transition of new technology on ships more seamless for a ship owner?
Yeah, so what you are pointing to is the introduction of the treatment systems on board. And as you say, it's a big challenge for the ship owners that this comes at a time when the financial situation is strained for a lot of the players. What we have done specifically is naturally work with the manufacturers of these systems to try and help them to find a good path to have their systems approved. And as you know, there are some different schemes in place, and we are now, as we speak, end of 2016, working very closely now to have more systems approved by the US Coast Guard, because that is holding back a lot of the ship owners from investing in these systems. Because naturally it would be beneficial to also have systems that are approved by the US Coast Guard to access the American markets.
DNV GL is a technical resource for a lot of companies. Do you see increased dependence on DNV GL and classification in general to help vessel owners keep abreast of emerging rules and technologies?
Yeah, so I think what you are pointing at is the role of class is not only about compliance, it's not only about, staying within the rules and regulations, but it's also a lot to, say, assist the owners and the different stakeholders in being abreast with new technologies. Looking at how they can comply not only with regulations that are enforced, but are also on the horizon to be implemented over the next few years. And as the many ship owners, ship managers have limited or to a lesser extent technical staff of their own, they are relying on classification societies to provide that competence. And I think DNV GL is at the forefront of giving advice in that respect.
Another big rule, another big regulation that obviously was enacted was the sulfur reduction through IMO from, I believe, 3% to 0.5% by 2020. Obviously, this was a rule that was expected, anticipated. Obviously, this is a rule that's going to have ramifications from the logistics of the fuel to the technical matters on board. Can you just shed some light about how you see the fuel switch coming, what DNV GL is doing in to help its customers prepare?
Yeah, so I think originally there was some debate whether this would come into force 2020 or 2025. It ended up with being 2020, so it pushes things forward. It's naturally good for the environment. It's another strain on the ship owners. So we are working, say, along different paths. So since 2001, we actually implemented rules for gas-fueled vessels, so using LNG as fuel. So this is naturally one area which will help ship owners become compliant with these new regulations. We have also produced notations being gas ready, which also helps the ship owners to, when they are ordering new vessels, to make the investments, the CapEx investments ready so that they don't need to fit the most expensive tanks at this point in time, but the vessels will be prepared for having those retrofitted at a later stage. So those are some aspects, and naturally we're working on scrubber technologies together with the manufacturers to help the manufacturers produce more reliable technologies. And these are, say, not just off-the-shelf products. So these are actually technologies that takes some effort into become reliable in the way that they are, say, practical to operate for the ship managers and owners. So these are some of the aspects. But I think the most significant contribution that we've made is probably on helping provide LNG as fuel, and that's also where we have the most experience, and we are the leading classification society in terms of market share for those vessels. And if I'm not wrong, as we speak, it is about 180 to 190 vessels either on the order book or in the sailing phase running on LNG as fuel.
But where are we on the path towards LNG? In the next 5 years, what do you expect? How do you expect to see the growth trajectory on LNG as a fuel in the maritime sector?
Yeah, I think what we tried a few years ago was to give a prediction for 2020 in the uptake. I think at that time we were too optimistic on the uptake. We predicted around 1,000 vessels. I don't think we will see this uptake within that time frame. But I think what we have been seeing is that the infrastructure around providing LNG as fuel, the bunkering systems, the port facilities, is all developing in a positive manner. And we have also introduced what we term as the LNG Eye, which is an interactive map showing where are the existing facilities for bunkering, what are the planned facilities, what are the status, which vessels are operating where, etc. And I think this is for the industry a very useful tool in knowing where things are going and where you can actually plan. If you are trading in this area, you can rely on having LNG as fuel supplied. So yes, I think LNG as fuel has potential. It's extremely difficult to predict the numbers, and naturally a lot depends on the price of fuel and the availability of the low sulfur fuels going forward.
In adjusting to this new fuel, what do you see as the emerging solution, the emerging dominant solution to deal with the issue?
No, I think it's going to be a variety of different solutions. So we are maybe not so much predicting one solution, but we would think that we will see a bigger diversity on the fuel choices of the future, ranging from what we talked about, LNG, but also the low sulfur marine gas oils, to also hybrid solutions using batteries. So it's difficult to predict one way. It all depends a lot on where you are trading, what are your profiles. But in conclusion, I would say it's a bigger variety that we will see going forward. But it's also very interesting now with the battery technology moving fast. And I think what we will see is, if not as the sole source, but as an auxiliary energy supply to be able to shave some of the peak loads from, for instance, crane operations or other systems on board that require a peak load. And that makes you run the gensets at a more optimal load, which is also energy efficient.
When you look out your regulatory porthole, do you see anything on the horizon that will have as or significant magnitude?
Yeah, I'm sorry to sort of bring bad news, but there is no relief on the regulatory inflow. And I think what we have next is the CO2 emissions and the monetary reporting and verification scheme introduced both by the IMO and the EU. So this will be the next, say, point for the ship owners, managers to pay attention to. Now we are in the initial phases of reporting this. Then there will be other issues like black carbon. It could be, say, other things on the agenda that will come. So I think if you try to look at this from a bird view perspective, the inflow of regulations is going to be putting a more demanding framework on the ship managers and operators. And that will cause not only, say, financial constraints, but also challenge the professionalism of the operations in itself. So yeah, there is quite a bit coming on the regulatory side.
And we've touched briefly on the future of class, but when you look at the marine industry, generally you're looking at an aging industry. And as you know, when you lose that inherent knowledge, that gap has to be filled. So I guess what I'm getting at, as you look at an aging workforce throughout the industry, you look at the evolution of class in general. How do you see class evolving to step in and fill some of those gaps?
Yeah, I think for most classification societies today, it is a challenge that we are faced with, tough market conditions. So there will not be that much recruiting going on for any classification society over the next few years. So I think we have to really look at how can we engage some of our younger employees that we have already. How can we, say, leverage the digitalization aspects of shipping that is opening up to make use of the young generation that we have, but also to combine that with the domain knowledge with the older and more experienced employees. And I think for us to really make that connection between, say, the more experienced, more senior employees and with those younger employees that we do have, I think that is one really very important aspect of that. And we, inside of DNV GL, we just had what we call the Next Generation Summit, where we try to make that linkage and also to utilize the very relevant knowledge that this new generation have of a social media, of a digitalization aspects, and which we can benefit a lot from, because my generation, we have to face it, we're somewhat outdated.
Absolutely. I feel that. But if you could narrow down to 3 the technologies that you think will have the greatest impact on this industry in the coming, say, 5 years, what do you see?
Oh, yeah, that is quite a tough question. Well, I think the biggest opportunity for the shipping industry lies within digitalization. I think this will open up opportunities for us to work more efficiently, to have better insights, and if I can phrase it like, so I'm an engineer, and at DNV GL we are a lot of engineers. So we are always looking for the whys. Why are things not working properly? Why are things going wrong, etc. But I think with the possibilities of digitalization, of using big data and making sense of that data, we put on a second set of glasses, and that is really what correlates with what. So not only are we looking at why things are not working properly, but we are looking at what correlates to what. And that gives us a tremendous new insight into, making new sense, making better predictions for the future, seeing when a pieces of equipment needs to be maintained or needs to be overhauled. And I think this would really give us a great opportunity to really move to the next level within shipping. So that is maybe more, a general aspect. The flip side of that is naturally cybersecurity. And the more sensors, the more transmittal of data, the more reliant we are on the data. Naturally, the more important it is to have good control of how that data is kept, how it is transmitted, and what is the quality of the data that you're looking at. And I think in that context, shipping really has to shape up to the, say, cybersecurity threats and how to mitigate that. So that would probably be one aspect. I mentioned that the diversity of fuels will play an important role going forward. So we talked a lot about that. But I think that will also put a lot of, challenges and demands on everyone working in the industry. And then maybe the last point, the third point, would probably be how can we use augmented or virtual reality to really speed up training, to really, put not only our surveyors, but the crew in a good environment where they can really leverage from a much faster training experience. And if you are in a simulator, you can have, say, 10 hours of training in a simulator that maybe can replace a year training on board a vessel, because you're just exposed to so much more at a much more efficient time frame. So I think those are probably my 3 choices of how I see technologies are really shaping shipping going forward.
When you look at cybersecurity and maritime, what do you see as the most important immediate steps to ensuring that a ship in a facility are cyber secure?
Yeah, so I think what we did towards SMM was to make our recommended practice for cybersecurity resilience management available to the industry. That is a good guide on what to look for, what are the threats, how can you mitigate those threats. But I think what you're raising is maybe even before that, there's something about awareness. There's something about realizing what are the threats that any ship could face today. And in that context, I would say that we introduced also an e-learning module intended for not only the onshore personnel, but also the crew. And that is really to raise awareness, because a lot of the issues has to do with the awareness. Exactly like you say, if you receive one of these memory sticks and you plug it into your computer, you could introduce accidentally malware or other things that could jeopardize the functions of the vessel. So really increasing awareness with the onshore and the crew. And then I think also what we've done, which I find really very practical, is to introduce an app. And I think this is quite cool that a classification society introduces an app that you can download from the App Store. But that app is really helping you as a ship owner or ship manager to assess the risks for your vessel or your fleet. And it's a self-assessment tool where you're basically going through a series of questions that helps you realize what are the threats facing my vessel or my operation. And then the next step would be to try and find mitigating measures against these. And I think that is a truly very practical, hands-on approach to really increase the awareness and the resilience against cyber threats.
Obviously, the role of big data in shipping has been a hot topic for a long time now. But big data, in my experience, means 100 different things to 100 different people. Can you give to me your definition of big data, but more importantly, a practical example of how big data is being used today to help make operations more efficient, more safe?
Okay, so I think let me start by saying that we've had data poverty for generations, meaning that we have not had enough data. We've had to make do with limited data sets, and then we make extrapolations and we try to make the best decisions out of what we have. So just to give you a very practical example, maybe the data set is not enormous, but when we are looking at our fleet, which is nearly 13,000 vessels, and we look at the port state control statistics, and we see that there are overrepresentation of certain vessel types and certain items that are being inspected by the port state authorities. So by applying, say, data analytics on our fleet, we were able to pinpoint 3 different vessel types that were more susceptible to port state detentions. And for those vessel types, we could drill down even further and look at, what are the detainable items. So based on this, say, data analytics, we could then produce a checklist of the most detainable items for these vessel types that we could share with the ship managers and the ship owners. And I think that is just a very practical example of how we can utilize, say, big data and analytics. My second example would be to look at some of the, say, pilot projects that we are doing with the customers as we speak, where we are downloading operational data from a relatively advanced vessel. And by looking at this operational data, we are able to extract knowledge about critical equipment on board. And for instance, we could find that for one specific piece of equipment, the temperature readings were really quite high at very regular intervals. Now, if this was allowed to continue, we would have an early breakdown of that specific piece of machinery. And by applying that second set of glasses that I talked about earlier, it's not only why things break down, but it's what correlates with what. And that high temperature reading was really a result of too high friction resulting from a crew member applying a too high torque to that specific equipment. And these are the sort of data sets that you can look at, and it will give you new knowledge, and we could quite easily adjust the instructions for that crew member so that he would apply the right torque, having the right friction, avoiding the high temperature and the most likely early breakdown of that equipment. So that are just two examples I find really very promising and gives a lot of potential for shipping going forward.
And we talk about a down market as a time to invest. Where does the reality hit the road? What is going on? Do you see companies out there investing in the technologies that we've discussed?
Yeah, I think we see both, actually. I mean, there are companies that are continuously investing in new insights, new technologies, and which makes a lot of sense these days because there is a lot of change going on, like we talked about. And there are companies that are in survival mode and will not have the ability or the capacity at the moment to really look into making investments. So there is both, I would say, and it has its natural reasons. But I think some of those that are not able to, say, make a lot of investments at this point in time may still benefit from what the industry is doing. And let me just give you one example, and that's how we have introduced drones for inspection of cargo holds in vessels. And I think this is, say, an investment that we have made, but we are also making it, say, accessible and available to the larger industry. And if you're a bulker owner of a bulker vessel, you can benefit from that technology being developed. And I think that is the good thing. It's also our purpose is to safeguard life, property, and the environment. But when we are investing into future technologies and future insights, it's also our way of returning back to the industry some of the benefits of working with us over time. And I think just by using drones, the bulker owner can save time and money, and that makes sense these days as well.
As you well know, this is a very conservative industry. Set in its way in some regards. Also, there is a changing of the guard of some sorts from a generational aspect. So how do you see DNV GL challenging the status quo of this industry, of not doing what has always been done with an eye on the present, but also on the future?
Yeah, I think this is a really very good question because it's in times like we are facing now, it's a lot about really challenging status quo and look at how can we work smarter, how can we work better, and how can we be more efficient as the times and the markets are changing. We did some, as I briefly mentioned, on the Next Generation Summit that we arranged to really connect our younger employees with the more senior experienced employees. It's really looking at new ways of doing old stuff, really challenging what is, say, outside of the box. And I think what we are doing on the drone survey is one such aspect, but maybe more importantly, what we are doing now with employing data analysts to really look into, big data sets. And how we can match that knowledge with that domain knowledge that we are well known to have and have had for 150 years. And I think these are some of the opportunities and great potential that lies ahead of us if we are able to match, say, the new possibilities, the data-rich environment with that of domain knowledge, and to really make, have those young, brilliant employees challenge old ways of doing things. And not everything will fly naturally, but to be able to look at some of those and try some of those out will be important for DNV GL going forward.
This is Greg Troutwine with Maritime Reporter TV, and again, we thank Knut for sharing his time and his insights with us.